If a system leads to the killing of a man who fed children and organized medical care, we cannot continue to find any comfort in that system. Welcome back to the Revolution Resolution. I'm Malaika Tubbs. In the last episode, we talked about the Rainbow Coalition, about people who had been taught to fear one another, choosing instead to accompany one another across race, neighborhood, and difference. We talked about Fred Hampton, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots organizing together to meet people's direct needs, feeding children, providing healthcare, supporting families, building community, and imagining a different kind of future. And today, I want to stay with that story a little longer, because before we move into conversations about how we begin living differently, how we build community differently, parent differently, love differently, and relate to one another differently, we must first be honest about what we are truly up against. Because the truth is, systems built on hierarchy do not quietly step aside when people begin choosing one another instead. One of the most dangerous myths many people inherit is the belief that harmful systems survive because they are natural or inevitable or too large to challenge. But history tells us something very different. Systems survive because they are protected. And when people begin successfully exposing another way of living, especially one rooted in collective care, shared humanity, and solidarity, the system often responds with force. Fred Hampton understood something profoundly threatening to American patriarchy. People become powerful when they stop seeing one another as enemies and begin recognizing their interconnectedness. He understood that Black communities, white communities, Puerto Rican communities, and other marginalized groups were all being harmed by systems rooted in hierarchy, scarcity, and concentrated power. And instead of allowing those groups to remain divided, he helped bring people together. Not theoretically, practically. Children were fed, health clinics were opened, communities were organized. Political education was shared. People experienced care where abandonment had become normalized. And that is exactly why he was treated as dangerous. Not because he was causing harm, but because he was proving that ordinary people could begin meeting one another's needs outside the logic of hierarchy and separation. That possibility threatened the system itself. This is something I want us to understand deeply. American patriarchy is not only maintained through ideas, it is maintained through punishment, through surveillance, through fear, through exhaustion, through disinformation, through division, and when necessary, through violence. The FBI's COINTELPRO specifically targeted movements and organizers who were building solidarity across communities. Not because coalition was criminal, but because coalition was powerful. Because once people begin recognizing that their struggles are interconnected, they become harder to isolate, harder to manipulate through fear, harder to convince that survival must happen alone. This is why systems rooted in hierarchy work so hard to keep people disconnected from one another. It is why people are encouraged to compete instead of collaborate, to fear instead of accompany, to protect status instead of practice solidarity, to stay exhausted enough that imagining alternatives feels impossible. And this is also why so many liberatory movements are killed off and erased from public memory. Many people learn more propaganda about destruction than they do about collective care, more about violence than mutual aid, more about conflict than solidarity. Because hopelessness protects the status quo. If people believe change is impossible, they stop trying. If people believe everyone is selfish, they stop trusting. If people believe care is naive, they stop organizing around it. But history repeatedly tells us another story. Again and again, ordinary people have risked comfort, safety, reputation, and even their lives to practice another way of living, to change the status quo. And over the next several episodes, I want to share more of those stories with you. Not to romanticize struggle, not to pretend liberation is easy, but because we need to understand both the beauty of this work and the resistance it inevitably encounters. We need to understand the stakes clearly, because once you fully see what the system protects and what it punishes, it becomes harder to continue mistaking it for freedom. It becomes harder to find any comfort in it, even if it's what you have always known. Despite all the threats and consequences, people have chosen and continue to choose to live differently. It is one of the most hopeful truths in our shared human history. So today, I want to leave you with a few questions. What kinds of care, connection, or solidarity have you been taught to dismiss as unrealistic? Who benefits when people remain isolated from one another? And what becomes possible once we stop confusing the protection of hierarchy with the protection of humanity? If this episode resonated with you, send it to someone who helps you imagine a more connected and courageous world. And remember, the difficulty and dangers of this work do not mean it is wrong. It reveals just how deeply necessary it truly is. We can face the challenges together.